I want to introduce our special guest, which I'm particularly very excited about. We've been working to bring Dr. Williams to campus for, I think, close to a year and a half now with all of the pandemic craziness. She was set to come a year ago, right around this time, and then we had to postpone it. So I am very much so looking forward to this. Dr. Monnica T. Williams is a board certified licensed clinical psychologist and associate professor at the University of Ottawa in the School of Psychology, where she is the Canada Research Chair in Mental Health Disparities. She's also the clinical director of the Behavioral Wellness Clinic in Connecticut, where she provides supervision and training to clinicians for empirically supported treatments. Dr. Williams' research focuses on African American mental health, culture, and psychopathology. And she has published over 100 scientific articles on these topics. Current projects include the assessment of race-based trauma, unacceptable thoughts and OCD, improving cultural competence in the delivery of mental health care services, and interventions to reduce racism. I will interject that much of her work has been incredibly influential in the field, and I will admit that it has been incredibly influential on me, which is one of the reasons why we're so excited to have her here. In addition to all of these accomplishments, she has served as the African American SIG leader for the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies, or ABCT, and she serves as an associate editor of the Behavior Therapist and New Ideas in Psychology. She also serves on the editorial board of Cognitive Behavior Therapy and the Journal of Obsessive Compulsive and Related Disorders. She is a member of the Scientific Advisory Board of the International OCD Foundation and co-founded their Diversity Council. Her work has been featured in several major media outlets, including NPR, Huffington Post, and the New York Times. And again, with how much she is influencing that, I will again just reiterate how excited we are to have her here. I know that her work on microaggressions, which she will talk about in just a minute, has been incredibly impactful for our department, the Department of Psychology, as well as a topic of discussion within the Minority Health Disparities Initiative, which is the organization putting on this talk today. She was at the forefront of a lot of our discussions on microaggressions in the last year, including through perspectives on psychological science. But I will stop rambling on about how excited we are to have her here and to get to listen to her talk, and turn this over to Dr. Williams. Thank you again and welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that really wonderful introduction. I wish that I could be there in person. That was our original plan. And then with the pandemic, we kind of pushed it back, and then we're like, well, I don't even know when we'll be able to travel again. So here I am virtually. Hopefully I can have an opportunity to come again and meet you all in person. But I am, broadcasting this from my home in Canada. I live outside of Ottawa, which is the nation's capital. People often ask where that is. I say, well, it's kind of between Toronto and Montreal, closer to Montreal. So if that gives you any idea about where I am, if you're not so familiar with the Canadian geography. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now so that you can see my slides. And without any further ado, I'm going to launch into my talk today, which is racial microaggressions in academic spaces, scope and impact. And I don't really need to say much more about myself after that wonderful introduction by Dr. Andrews. But I will, this is a picture of the building where I work. Actually, it's a really nice, fantastic, brand new building, and you can't really see it, but behind it and attached to it is like this, I don't know, like 50-year-old building that's like not nearly as cool where my office actually is. So, oh well. I am a professor in the School of Psychology. I also have a joint appointment in cellular and molecular medicine. Don't know how that happened, but it sounds really cool. And I do research. I see clients. I mostly supervise students, diverse students who see diverse clients. including clients with racial trauma, among other things. I've worked in academic medicine at the University of Pennsylvania and the University of Connecticut. I'd like to give a little warning as I get started that this material that I'm going to share can be difficult. It can be challenging for people. I hear this sometimes, especially if you are somebody that maybe has been impacted by racism, or or some of these ideas are new, or you even realize that maybe you've done some of these things. So if you feel uncomfortable during this talk, that's like totally normal. And it doesn't mean anything bad about you. Actually, it probably means you're a very sensitive and conscientious person. So, all right. Oh, fun fact about myself. In addition to all the other things that Dr. Andrews mentioned that I study, I also study psychedelics for mental health. So, yeah, and if someone had told me 10 years ago I'd be doing that, I'd have thought they were insane. But that is also one of my fun research areas. All right. Moving on. So let's get started. And I want to talk about a little bit about diversity. So, there's a lot of important ways that people can be diverse, and recognition and appreciation of diverse categories and identities is tended to focus on these categories, which include race, ethnicity, culture, gender, sex, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, age, disability, and religion. The Big Eight were named by the National Association of Independent Schools as part of a discussion about equality, equity, and diversity. And one thing that I think is important to mention is that, like, within each of these identities are varying degrees of social stigma or privilege. So stigmatized identities are more likely to be met with disfavor and ostracization, whereas privileged identities tend to garner favor and respect. As a result, discrimination on the basis of these identities is very common. Almost all of the identities above are what we would call ascribed rather than acquired, meaning that people have very little control at an individual basis as to which of these identities they possess. Although some degree of change is possible, for the most part, people are born or socialized into these identities. And so no one should be stigmatized or privileged on the basis of these alone. Now, race and ethnicity, it's number 2 on the list there, are among the most highly stigmatized identities in our culture, and really powerful determinants of many basic attributes, such as where you will live, where you will go to school, how much money you'll make, who you will marry, and if you will be incarcerated. Our culture does place a high value on being non-discriminatory, but we know the research shows us that people do react to others based on their presumed racial and ethnic identity. And in fact, people are very uncomfortable when they can't ascertain somebody's racial or ethnic identity, because we do so much of this categorization. It's so important to us at a certain level that we're not always aware of, that it can be very hard for someone to interact with someone without being able to put them in a category. Now, these are not the only ways people can be diverse. There's been some move away from emphasizing the Big Eight, because there are really many even additional important social identifiers, such as family origin and family structure, geographic and regional background, nationality, language, appearance, body image, learning style and behavior, academic and social achievement, right? I have a PhD, so people have to call me doctor, and that puts me in a certain privileged category, whereas being a woman of color puts me in a stigmatized category. So people may be in many different categories. Also, they may be categorized by their beliefs or their political or social or religious designation, or even, what fraternity or sorority they're a part of. Now, these dimensions of diversity, they're not necessarily additive. So sometimes people have 2 or more of these identities. It almost makes like a new category, because based on the way people may treat them or react to them. So there's kind of a danger of mixing or combining diversity dimensions, because it's not always straightforward to do that. Yeah, so for example, being Black and male in our society is much more difficult than being Black and female, depending on what you want to do. So if you're shopping, it's going to be harder to be Black and male because you're going to be more likely to be criminalized. Or if you're driving, you're more likely to be pulled over if you're Black and male. But in academia, for example, if you're Black and male, you're more likely you're more likely to be appreciated by students than if you're Black and female. And research has shown that as well. So sometimes the intersections don't necessarily make sense logically, right? Okay, so so before we launch into talking about microaggressions, first we need to talk about racism, because microaggressions, racial microaggressions, which is the subject of my talk today, are a form of racism. And most people think they know what racism is, but actually it's not just simply like, I don't like you because of your skin color. And certainly that can be a form of racism. And when we talk about old-fashioned racism, it covers that for sure. But there are many types of racism, and the form has changed over the decades because it's not really as acceptable to be openly racist. So a lot of people, have maintained their racism, but they have found different ways to rationalize it. So for example, one type of racism is symbolic or modern racism. And these are people who may embrace negative stereotypes about people of color. For example, they may believe that Black people are morally inferior to white people. We sometimes refer to that as right-wing racism. Another type of racism is aversive racism, where people may outwardly support racial equality, but actually have negative or conflicted feelings toward people of color. And it's often unconscious, not always, but we sometimes refer to that as left-wing racism, very common on university campuses. And then, we have microaggressions, which is going to be the main subject of our discussion today. And microaggressions are small, subtle, covert acts of racism. They're oftentimes including patronizing statements and backhanded compliments. And then finally, we have structural racism, which is a kind of racism that's baked into all of our institutions, policies, and procedures. And so you can have racist outcomes without anybody being explicitly racist or feeling like they want to hurt somebody, but the way that the rules and the policies and procedures and systems are set up, you can have negative outcomes toward people of color as a result. So, and there's other forms of racism too, but those are some of the big ones. And when we talk about racism, people often focus on intent, but it's really important to understand that conscious intent is not necessary to perpetrate racism. Overt feelings of hate and prejudice are not necessary to perpetrate racism. And again, racism is often hidden, subtle, and covert. You can really kind of dislike the idea of racism on the whole and still commit racist acts, even without necessarily realizing that you're doing something racist, because maybe that's just the way you were taught. So, and I didn't talk about systemic racism because all racism is systemic by definition. And so here are some of the larger ways that racism plays out. It's important to understand that it is a system of beliefs, which include racial prejudices, practices, which includes racial discrimination, and policies, which is structural racism. And all of these things operate to advantage those with historical power, which means white people in most Western nations. So in the US and in Canada as well, race is a caste system that's used to group people based on shared physical features. It's ever evolving. Race is a social construct with no biological basis. So that's really important to understand, because I think a lot of people think that racial categories are like there's some real biological meaning behind that, but there's not. And in fact, racial categories, they're defined by the Census Bureau, and they change just about every time we do a census. They rearrange things. Like, for example, Hispanic used to be considered a race. Now it's considered an ethnic group. So a lot of Hispanic people were very surprised to find that racially they weren't Hispanic anymore. And that's an example of how it's a social construct. Those folks, their DNA did not change when the census redefined the categories. But in fact, but how the government classifies people had changed. And then as a result, sometimes that changes the way people think about groups. So again, it has no biological basis. Race is actually a racist construct because it was invented to separate people. And it stems from white supremacy, which is an ideology that presumes the superiority of white people and inferiority of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. And so the roots of racism can be traced back to imperialism, colonialism, and the transatlantic slave trade. Although the concept of racism, as we understand it now and as we study it, is rather contemporary. So here are some examples of different kinds of racism. I won't read all these, but there's some examples to help with your learning if some of these are new terms for you. Okay, now in our culture, there's I should say, divided perspective on racism. And white people in our society tend to believe that racialized groups are doing well in life and racism is no longer an issue and discrimination is declining. Also, they tend to feel that they are not capable of racist behaviors. Now, people in racialized groups, on the other hand, are confronted with daily acts of racism, sometimes from those very people who think they're not capable of racist acts. So they have a very different perspective on this. They have a different reality. Sometimes people say, people of color, white people live in two different Americas because of differences in how they're treated and how they experience the world as a result. Now, white people tend to limit their definition of racism to blatant, intentional, overt acts. But few people who commit racist acts will admit to intentionally wanting to harm others due to race. So if we define race that way, then very few acts of racism would be considered racism. But the fact of the matter is, even good people enact racism. And the problem is that acts of racism are often overlooked by those who do not experience it. And in fact, most white people in Western culture are socialized not to see racism, whereas people of color often have to see it for their own safety and well-being. All right, there we go. Now, racism is real and systemic, and sometimes people wonder if, for example, racism afflicts white people too, right? So I see there is a question in the chat about reverse racism. And so first of all, there's, it doesn't really exist. So racism, again, it's a system. So there's no system in the United States, there's no large structural system that disadvantages white people. At least if there is, nobody has identified it yet. And in fact, the data show us that racism is real and systemic. And this is a comparison of Black versus white Americans. And as you can see, by every economic and educational indicator, Black people are doing worse than white people. So a typical Black household has accumulated less than 1/10 of the wealth of a typical white one. And actually, it's only getting worse. In the past 25 years, the wealth gap between Black and white people has nearly tripled. And the racial gap in who's graduating from college has widened since 2007, with Black and Hispanic people slipping further behind white people in college graduation rates. So, so it is true, for example, that a Black person could have feelings of prejudice and dislike and meanness toward a white person just because they're white. But that wouldn't be considered racism because there's no systemic way for them to harm the other person. But I mean, certainly that wouldn't be good either. And there's no evidence that that Black people as a group are oppressing white people or even have the ability to do so on a group level. So yeah, so there's no reverse racism happening. Okay. Now this is Dr. Chester Pierce, and he looks so kind and sweet there. And he is the one who came up with the term for microaggressions. He invented the term. He's a Harvard psychiatrist. He graduated from Harvard. He was a professor at the medical school there. And he identified the microaggressions back in the 60s when he noticed that that was what was happening to him all the time. Actually, he noticed his students were doing microaggressions against him and making comments and suggestions and taking liberties that they would never ever do with white professors. And I remember reading about Dr. Chester Pierce's experiences and thinking, oh my gosh, that was 50 years ago, it's still happening. And one of the things he said about microaggressions is that, you know, most offensive actions, and he called these offensive, as sort of an opposite to Freud's defensive mechanisms. He called these offensive mechanisms. And he said, these are not gross and crippling, they're subtle and stunning. The enormity of the complications they cause can be appreciated only when one considers that these subtle blows are delivered incessantly. Even though any single negotiation of offense can in justice be considered of itself to be relatively innocuous, the cumulative effect to the victim and to the victimizer is of an unimaginable magnitude. So what is he saying here? He's saying that these microaggressions, even though they seem small, they're subtle, but the target is often stunned by them when they happened. And the fact that they're happening all the time causes them to have a very, very large, I don't know, outcome, big result, big problem, right? So he went on to say, hence the therapist is obliged to pose the idea that offensive mechanisms are usually a microaggression, as opposed to a gross, dramatic, obvious macroaggression, such as a lynching. Now, our society does not stand in need of new laws or innovative plans, such as it stands in need of eliminating offensive maneuvers from any process of interaction which involves majority and minority citizens. So basically, he's saying that if we could just stop microaggressions, we really wouldn't need to have any more of a civil rights agenda. That really this would probably solve most of our problems. And I think Chester Pierce, he was really, really brilliant. He went on to say that racism is a mental health and public health disease, characterized by perceptual distortion, contagion, and fatality. And he had postulated long before anyone did any research that racism was a source of physical and mental unwellness, which has since been found to be true. So, and he said that it's also a delusion because people see it, but they say they don't see it. And they often think they don't see it, even when it's right in front of them. And so he called it a delusion, you know, of kind of grand proportions. Yeah. So, okay. All right, so I guess we have a question here too that says, so if you're black or Hispanic, you're saying you cannot be racist or have racism issues because you're oppressed by the white population, so there's no other race to oppress. And I would say not exactly. Actually, people of color can and do enact racism, but in order for it to be racism, that means they're enacting racism that ultimately is a product of oppression by white society and benefits white society. So for example, we have a socio-racial hierarchy, right? If we have some people who, because by virtue of their race, have more social privilege, and others who have less, and then some people who have the least. So at the bottom of the socio-racial hierarchy in our country tend to be Black and Native American people. And then maybe usually Hispanic and Asian people will fall somewhere in between. So you could certainly have, you know, somebody who's in that, maybe in a more middle category, express racism or towards somebody who may be below them on that hierarchy. But generally, in the end, it's actually not helping. It's not, you know, it's not helping really anybody. It's all sort of under the umbrella of white supremacy, because if we didn't have these categories, then people wouldn't be able to oppress each other in that way. So, so I hope that makes sense. So I could give one concrete example from my own family. In fact, when I was small, I struggled with asthma. I actually still have asthma. And my grandmother, when I was having bad asthma, she would say, well, let's take you to the German doctor in town, right? She didn't want to take me to the Black doctor because in her mind, maybe the Black doctor wasn't as good as the white doctor who was German, I guess. And so even though, you know, her desire was to get me the best treatment possible, this was an action of racism, because she was really kind of dismissing the Black doctor as being as knowledgeable and useful as the white doctor. So, and so, yeah, so people of color can enact racism as well. All right. All right, so what are microaggressions? Let's define these. These have been defined as small racist acts that are not clearly racially motivated, right? So, because people generally, they're not calling someone the N-word, they may be doing something that seems a little bit rude or a little strange, or saying something that's like a little off, but it's not obviously racism, usually very not obvious to the perpetrator and the target. They usually know, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're trying to figure it out. And these occur frequently in everyday situations, and they create uncertainty and anxiety in ethnic and racial minorities, because they're trying to figure out like what just happened, and should I be worried about that, and why did that person do that, and do they treat it, you know, everybody that way, or just people of color? So oftentimes people on the receiving end are left with like their wheels spinning, trying to figure out like what happened there, like what was the point of that behavior or interaction. And they are really, like, unfortunately common. So for example, one study observed community college interactions and recorded microaggressions in 30% of the classrooms. And most of the microaggressions, if not all, went unchallenged. And a lot of the microaggressions, actually most of them, were from professors. So, and actually quite diverse professors too. So again, anybody can commit a microaggression. And so again, the problem is that the targets of microaggressions are often forced to determine whether another person, in fact, perpetrated a discriminatory act. And this ambiguity or the uncertainty, you know, causes a lot of stress on people. And some people have postulated that maybe racial microaggressions are just a misstep, a cultural misstep, or a faux pas, but they are not. They actually are a form of oppression, which reinforces the traditional power structures and differentials between groups, whether or not this was the conscious intention of the offender. So, as such, there's an underlying connection between the message embedded in the microaggression and its relationship to pathological stereotypes about the target that supports existing power structures, right? So, and that's how you can tell it's a microaggression, because it's going to reinforce those negative stereotypes, right? So I gave the example of my grandmother saying, I want to take you to the German doctor in town. Well, that's again the stereotype that the Black person is not as competent, intelligent, or as capable. So, so again, these microaggressions, these are hinged to these pathological stereotypes. And certainly, you know, stereotypes can be in general, broadly, as we talk about them in psychology, can be sort of very useful mental shortcuts, you know, to help us make decisions quickly. But when we use stereotypes to determine facts about different ethnic and racial groups, they are actually wrong. So stereotypes, so please, like, write this down. If you take away one thing from today's talk, it should be that stereotypes about ethnic and racial groups are wrong. And the reason they're wrong is because society puts labels or characteristics on groups as a way to explain power differences in a way that kind of helps to explain these differences without making the in-group or the group in power really feel bad about the differences. So for example, and so groups that have fewer social and economic advantages are going to be stereotyped in a way that helps explain those disparities in a way that makes the in-group feel good. So for example, although disadvantaged group members may have greater difficulty finding a job, say due to in-group favoritism, racism, related social forces, the disadvantaged group is going to be unfairly characterized as unmotivated. So like, oh, if he could find a job if he looked hard enough, or unintelligent, like, oh, he's not smart enough to have that job, or lazy, oh, he would rather take handouts than work. So have you heard any of these stereotypes about disadvantaged ethnic and racial groups? I bet you have. And also we see this actually worldwide across cultures. So these are very similar to stereotypes that are used to describe Black people in Britain or Turks in Germany, despite the fact that these groups have a very separate culture and history, right? Because that's kind of what tends to happen. So again, so microaggressions are going to be connected to these stereotypes. And it's important to understand that even small instances of discrimination, or what can seem like they're small to the perpetrators, can cause psychological distress to targets or victims when experienced with enough frequency. And this is a microaggression. This is supposed to illustrate a microaggression around using Native American mascots for sports teams. Okay. So, so somebody put in the chat, something that happens to me is white people making the comment to me that I'm so articulate. They cannot seem to understand when I try to educate them on this, that it's really offensive. Yes, thank you so much for that example, actually. This is a unfortunately common microaggression that often happens to Black people. And the reason it's a microaggression is because there's maybe a stereotype or an expectation that Black people wouldn't be articulate, that they wouldn't speak well, that they wouldn't use the right words or phrases, or that they would have to sound a certain way. And so people think they're complimenting a Black person that they feel speaks in a way that they like. And I get this a lot myself. People will sometimes say, oh, I loved your talk. You were so articulate. And I always kind of cringe because it's like, it's not really a compliment. I mean, I'm a college professor. I hope I'm articulate. I hope that I'm well-spoken. I hope I can get my ideas across clearly. So yeah, it's not really a compliment. And you often don't see people making that kind of comment to white people. Oh, you're so articulate. Because there's an expectation that, oh, well, of course they're going to talk well because they're white, right? So yeah, it's not a compliment. Don't say that to Black people. I mean, maybe there would be a couple that would like that, but most of us know. So yeah, so don't do that. Okay, and so here's another question: how can you differentiate if it's a microaggression or acts of kindness when someone comments on your strength in regards to coping with continued murders of Black and brown people by police? Yeah. So, so sometimes, it's tough to know. And I think if you're unsure, you would really want to ask the person that you're making the comment to, is that helpful? Because sometimes people don't know, and, it's a learning process for all of us. But the problem with a comment like that is there are stereotypes about Black people being strong. And even a lot of Black people have embraced these stereotypes because, it feels better to say that you're strong than to feel like you've been oppressed. And I do think Black people as a culture are strong and are resilient. But the problem is that this stereotype came about during the slavery era as a way to excuse the harsh treatment that Black people received. So it was like, oh, they're strong. They can go out in the fields. They can, pick cotton. They can take, 40 lashes with a whip. It's okay. They're strong, sturdy people. We can rape them whenever we feel like it. And so that made people feel less bad about abusing Black people. And that still goes on today, actually, because of these stereotypes, there's actually quite a lot of harm that happens to Black people because of these stereotypes. If you don't see somebody's vulnerabilities, it's very easy to dehumanize them and forget that they have feelings. And even we have research that shows, for example, doctors are less likely to give pain medicine to Black people compared to white people, because number one, they may have stereotypes, oh, they're strong, they don't need pain medicine. And then also they have negative stereotypes about Black people being drug abusers, which is also false. So these stereotypes actually do have like real world implications. So the whole comment about being strong can be a double-edged sword. I'd be real careful about that. Like, if someone was going to compliment me, I wouldn't want them to compliment me on how strong I am for dealing with racism all the time, which is true. I do deal with a lot of racism, but I would want them to compliment me on like being a good scholar and academic and recognizing my professional accomplishments, because that's what I do to distinguish myself. Or if they're a personal friend, I'd want them to recognize me for being a good mom or being a good friend or being a good spouse. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I hope that answers your questions. Now we're going to talk a little bit about different types of microaggressions. And I know so far it's been a little abstract. I mean, I've given you a few examples, but if you're not really familiar with microaggressions, that could make it harder to, it could be hard to understand the scope of microaggressions and to identify them. So I'm going to give you a list of some types of microaggressions, categories and examples. Now, again, microaggressions are everywhere. They're like everywhere. And these are some categories of microaggressions that came out of our research that built upon the research of Sue and colleagues in 2007. They're very influential paper on this topic in American Psychology, which I say with a little bit of pain because I have not ever been able to get an article published there. I keep trying though. Although I'm starting to move into the realm of learned helplessness on that. But in any case, there was a very influential article about this with some theoretical categories that had not yet been sort of empirically tested. And since then, there's been a lot of research that has borne out that these categories are, in fact, mostly accurate. So we have some categories that are a little bit different, mostly the same, and some examples from each category. Now, it's really important to keep in mind that microaggressions are context dependent, which means that something could be a microaggression in one case and not a microaggression in another case. And I tried to think of things that would like almost always be microaggressions for these examples, but you might be able to come up with a situation where maybe it's not a microaggression. So so the article I mentioned, is an American Psychologist. It's by Sue and colleagues, and it's about microaggressions. It's called Racial Microaggressions in Everyday Life, Implications for Clinical Practice. And it was written for psychologists, but it's been very wide-reaching, far-reaching concepts. So here's some examples. I won't read all of these, but hopefully you can kind of tell why these might be microaggressions and why people on the receiving end wouldn't necessarily appreciate it. So, for example, the category false colorblindness, like someone says, oh, I don't think of you as Hispanic. Well, if you like being Hispanic and you're proud of your culture and you like your culture, and for someone to say I don't think of you as that doesn't necessarily feel good. Like what if you're a female and your boyfriend's like, I don't think of you as a woman. If you identify as a woman, you might not like that, right? So, okay. And then here's a few other examples of microaggressions. Now, one thing you might notice is that not all microaggressions are things people say, sometimes they're things people do, and sometimes they're just things that are there, like in the environment. These last two are environmental microaggressions, and I'll give more examples of those as we go. But this is a problem. I mean, this is a problem in Canada too. Actually, we have some statues and historical figures who did some pretty awful things that we still celebrate them in their, you know, by naming universities after them and so forth. So, okay, all right. So let's see, a couple more questions here. In the realm of therapy, how are mental health practitioners helping individuals cope with microaggressions? Well, the honest answer is they're really kind of not, which is one of the things I'm hoping to change by raising awareness, because people do need help coping with microaggressions. And sadly, most mental health practitioners haven't had good training around that. And I'd love to hear your perspective on fetishization of Black people and Black culture by white folks as a microaggression. It is, as you can see, number 13, exoticization and eroticization. I'm especially curious about the sexualization of Black girls and Black men by white men and white women, respectively, and the commodification of Blackness. Yeah, really good comment. You know, sometimes when I'm doing these talks, I put things in Google because I'm looking for pictures. And it used to be if I would type in Black woman, a bunch of sexualized pictures of Black women would come up. So that sort of tells us, you know, where society's mind is around that particular demographic, right? So again, this goes back to slavery era, and there were stereotypes about Black women. There were kind of basically maybe 3 or 4 overarching stereotypes about Black women. You know, one of them was that these Black women were these nurturing mammies, you know, because, you know, you had to kind of find a way to make it okay about the fact that the Black women were taking care of the white people's babies all the time. So it's like, yeah, nurturing mammies, like they like to take care of babies, they like to cook and serve us. But there was also a stereotype about them being hypersexual, and that was an excuse that was used to explain the fact that like all these Black slaves had these, you know, mixed race babies. How did that happen? Oh, well, they were seducing all the white men, right? So rather than actually admitting that they were being raped all the time. So, and that persists to this day, and it sells products, it sells music videos. And so that's why you keep seeing it. And it's sad but true. Okay. All right, so now some people have taken exception to the term microaggression because it has the word aggression in it, and you know, when Sue originally wrote about microaggressions, he said, you know, they're unconscious, they're unintentional, people don't really want to be doing these to other people. And I think he was a little too quick to say that, because we didn't really have research that showed whether or not they're unintentional or intentional, whether or not they're innocuous, or, well, he didn't say they were innocuous, but he wanted to give offenders the benefit of the doubt. And I think there's certainly something to be said to that. And maybe he wouldn't have been able to get his article published if he had said something different. But the fact of the matter is, you know, microaggressions, they have the word micro at the front, which some people don't like that, because that implies that the harm that they do is small, when sometimes it's not. Sometimes there's a lot of harm. And then there's the word aggression at the end, which implies that, you know, the person who did it is aggressive. And you know, there's a lot of people who don't like the fact that it's aggression, because they're like, well, aggression, you have to be intentional and you have to be looking to harm someone. And I mean, and that's actually not always true. So yeah. So one question people ask is, you know, is this a fair term? Are microaggressions aggressive? You know, and I thought, well, I mean, I don't know, on the receiving end, they feel aggressive to me, but you know, that's not really science. That's my perception. So maybe we should do a study and see if microaggressions are correlated to aggression, and which was something that Scott Lilienfeld suggested, that that people should do that study. He was a kind of a detractor and critic of microaggressions. So, we have a comment here. There is popular research on the flip side of the microaggression debate. There is popular research. A lot of people cite Dr. Scott Lilienfeld, Jonathan Haidt, Jordan Peterson, Thomas Sowell. It seems that the psychometrics show negligible support for the effects you are talking about as it relates to racial groups. Have you examined the other side of the research or can speak to it? Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm actually going to be speaking to that as we go. But first of all, Scott Lilienfeld's theories and ideas about microaggressions, and for those of you who aren't familiar with the debate, he had argued that microaggressions, were not a strong concept, that there really wasn't science to support it. And he was actually quite wrong. His paper on this was very unscientific. I did finally write a rebuttal to that in the same journal where his article came out, and then he died. So, but in any case, but yeah, the science is actually much stronger and in better shape than he thought, and it's even stronger now a few years after the fact. Jonathan Haidt is a supporter of Lilienfeld's work, although he's not neither of them are actually diversity researchers. They're really kind of like more talking heads when it comes to this topic. And Jonathan Haidt, he hasn't really done research on microaggressions. So a lot of people who critique it, they haven't done the work. And most of these are white men, which isn't to say it's bad to be a white man, but as a white man, you're going to be at a disadvantage when talking about racial microaggressions because you don't experience them and you've been socialized not to see them. So you're really kind of the last person that should weigh in unless you've really done your homework on this and done some research on it. Not everybody there's a white man, but that being said, I think that people need to maybe temper their ideas about it until they actually study it, right? You don't get to you shouldn't get to write a journal article and put things out there as facts and statements on something that you actually haven't studied. So that's my 2 cents there. But anyway, all that to say, Scott Lilienfeld did question whether or not microaggressions were aggressive. And so I did this study to look at how if microaggressions are a form of aggression, and they actually are a form of aggression. And in fact, microaggressions are a form of racial microaggressions are a form of racism and a form of aggression. They're robustly correlated to, I think, about 5 different measures of racism and 4 different measures of aggression. And so hopefully I can drop the mic on that one. We know that they're racist and aggressive. Now, this isn't to say that everyone who commits a microaggression is a racist, aggressive person, but on average, more aggressive people will commit more microaggressions, and people who are more racist will commit more racial microaggressions. So that's how that works. And here's my little diagram for what happens in these situations. So people have false stereotypes about people of color, which leads to racial bias. And so sometimes, for example, in situations where they may be around people of color, they may have interracial anxiety for one reason or another, which gives rise to hostility and fear. So when people feel anxious, they may have hostility and fear. And so as a result, they want to control the situation to reduce their fear and anxiety. And so then they commit a microaggression. And the microaggression can be a direct offensive action, or it could be avoidance or flight. So, okay. And that's how it works. So anyway, and if you have any, and so I'm kind of still evolving this model. So if you have any thoughts about it, I would love your feedback. Now, we did some focus groups of Black students at predominantly white institutions. We talked to Black students at several different schools in the Midwest, on the West Coast, and at a medical school, at a public institution. And we found that that interestingly, like they had a lot of the same things to say about the microaggressions that they were experiencing on campus. And so I want to share with you some of the first person accounts of people in that we brought into our lab for these interviews. And this was kind of part of a larger project that we did to inform the development of an anti-racist intervention called the Racial Harmony Workshop. And so, yeah, I won't go into the details of that unless there's specific questions, but let it suffice to say that that our students had a lot of interesting things to say, and I'm going to share with you a couple of their quotes. Although some of these I probably don't need to share because some of you have actually already said some of the things that they've said too. So, okay. So remember that list I showed you of different types of microaggressions. The first one on the list, we call it not a true citizen, and it was also described by Sue as alien in own land. And it was based on the assumption that the target is not a true American, although we kind of widen this because I'm in Canada, so it could also be someone's not a true Canadian or someone's not a true German or wherever you live. It reinforces the notion that non-white people are probably immigrants, and so they're not legitimate citizens or a meaningful part of the larger society. So if you think about, like, you know, the stereotypes here and the harm that it does, well, first of all, it, you know, again, it stereotypes folks, people of color as, you know, not being like real Americans, and it communicates exclusion and lack of belonging that can make people feel like outsiders. And even though this is most typically talked about in relation to Asian Americans, Latinx Americans, but African Americans in our focus group reported experiencing this as well. So, and here's a few examples of things they said. One said, "My head is shaved, actually. I hear a lot of things. It's really annoying. Oh, do you shave your head for a religious thing or like an African ritual or something?" Because they see the pictures and stuff in the media and they automatically assume that, oh, where are you from? Are you from like Africa? And another one said, just a few months ago, someone who works in the Office of Admissions was with students from Tanzania, and she asked me where I was from, and I said, you know, small town in Kentucky. And she said, no, before that, where are you from? And I said, Kentucky, I was born here. And she said, no, seriously, your name is such and such. You have to be from outside of America, right? So yeah, so the question is like, who gets to be an American, right? Do we all get to be Americans, or do only some of us get to be Americans? Now here's a really ugly example of something that happened to like a very beautiful woman. This was from 2014, where Nina Davuluri, Miss New York, was crowned the winner of the Miss America pageant. She was the first contestant of Indian descent to be crowned Miss America. And when her win was announced, Twitter immediately exploded with hateful tweets, with people calling her an Arab. And by the way, she's Hindu. And shock that an Indian American woman could win because this is America. Other people were offended that she was crowned Miss America so close to the anniversary of 9/11 and joked about her having possible ties to a terrorist group like Al-Qaeda. And some people were just outright racist, and they said things like, Miss America, you mean Miss 7-Eleven. One of the most heavily shared pictures of the night was a 4-panel image of Miss Kansas, Teresa Vale, with people claiming Teresa Vale is what a real Miss America looks like. All right, so take a look at these pictures for a minute, and maybe you can tell me why many people thought that Teresa Vale on the right is what a real Miss America looks like. So, you know, our country is very diverse, and but because of these negative, harmful stereotypes, you know, this cast a really, I thought, negative, you know, pall on the pageant. So, And by the way, Teresa Vale, she did not appreciate the racist comments either. And she said, no, you know, Nina won and she deserved to win. And please stop posting these things. By the way, Nina now uses her voice and platform to champion for diversity, women's empowerment, STEM education, and healthy living, actually. And one of the things she talks about is colorism, which is a big problem everywhere. I mean, in many countries, particularly in India, where generally you have to have lighter skin to be a big star. And she talks about colorism being a component of racism. She says the core belief is that lighter skin is the ticket to success and beauty. Unless we can change that core belief, we can't change colorism or racism. Every time a company creates a skin lightening product and every time a celebrity endorses a skin lightening product, they're sending a message that dark skinned people are not enough, that they're not worthy, and that they're not valued. And for those of you who may not be aware, there are actually many skin lightening products that are targeted toward people with darker skin. And these are not as popular here in the US, but they have big followings in a lot of other countries. And they're made by companies that with names we would recognize, like Johnson & Johnson and Unilever. And they push these products, which are actually can be quite bad for your skin, and you know, and reinforce racism. So she's currently the host of a new reality show called Made in America on ZTV, and she also hosts charity and entrepreneurial events nationally and internationally. I kind of wanted to let you know where she ended up after that, you know, that horrible, embarrassing thing that happened when she was crowned Miss America. Okay. So now Gerald Wing Su, the one I mentioned who published the article, one of the most influential articles about microaggressions, he was born in Portland, Oregon, and he's of Asian descent. And he frequently receives compliments from other people on his grasp of English, okay? And he'll usually reply with, thank you, I hope so, I was born here. So one of the things he notes is that when people make comments like this, they don't realize they're sending out a meta communication or a hidden message stating their belief that he's a perpetual alien in his own country. So yeah, so that's a microaggression. Another category that we mentioned was racial categorization and sameness. And this is intended to describe microaggressions that happen when a person of color is compelled to disclose their racial identity to others. So remember when I said sometimes people can be really uncomfortable if they can't put you in a box. And so in their efforts to understand what category you're in so that they can like attach their stereotypes to you, they might ask you, what are you, right? And then that leads to the expression of pathological stereotypes based on that identity. And then it also applies when people make comments or assumptions that people of a given race are all alike, overlooking the complexity of a person's identity. And it results in the harmful ascription of stereotypes that may serve to disconnect an individual from their actual heritage or lived experience, or incorrectly ascribe attributes to one's heritage or experience, or force unwanted attributes or group responsibility to an individual. And this can be particularly challenging for people who identify as biracial or multiracial, because they may struggle to feel accepted. They may feel confused about their identity, and they may feel social pressure to align with a single identity to make other people more comfortable about, you know, being able to pick a box for them. So yeah, and here's an example from our focus group. I was folding t-shirts one day, and this boy came up to me and said, Jasmine, I've been meaning to ask you this. What are you? I said, I'm a girl. He said, no. What's your race? I'm like, I'm Black. He was like, no way, no way. I'm like, if you see my entire family, I'm literally Black, but I don't think I look anything but Black, but he wouldn't believe it. So yeah, that's always like, that's often an awkward conversation. And I guess we have a comment too about being an American, which I was just talking about as well. When we talk about being American, and that to be American is often equated with whiteness, when in reality it's been colonized by white people. As a psychologist and professional, how do we acknowledge Indigenous people and their land that was taken from them? Yeah, well, you know, I mean, it kind of depends on the situation, but I think it's important that when we see or hear microaggressions along these lines, that, you know, that we go out of our way to correct it, and to point out that, yeah, no, actually, you know, the real Americans were, you know, were here long before Europeans, you know, Europeans came to this continent. Now, one of the things that people of color are often faced with are assumptions about intelligence, competence, or status, you know, simply based on how they look. And this category includes any positive or negative ascriptions of intellectual abilities, competence, education, or social standing based on racial assumptions. And this was a common phenomenon encountered in our focus group, which we call counter-stereotypical surprise, or assumed exceptionalism, like, oh, you're not like other Black people. So many of our African-American focus group respondents said that they encountered disbelief when they demonstrated academic excellence or expressed professional career ambitions. And then also reverse assumptions are often made about people of Asian heritage, with people assuming that they're smart, studious, and good at math and science, you know, whether or not they are. And here's an example of a microaggression in the classroom. The professor says, "This is a really difficult class, so all the Black students should sign up for tutoring right away." This is a real example. I couldn't make these up. And I know this might seem really blatant to you, but the point of the matter is the professor, he thought he was being helpful, didn't realize that he was being racist, right? So that's a microaggression. And this student says, "We were deciding where we wanted to go to college, and these people were supposed to help us." So she's talking about our trip to the high school guidance counselor's office. "I went there and I was like, oh, here are the places I want to apply and I'm interested in." And she's like, "I think you should look at community colleges." I'm like, "What are you talking about? I had a 3.7 GPA. What do you mean I should look at community colleges?" I was like, "Well, I'm not really interested in community college. This is my list. I've already decided." And she was like, "No, let's look at this." And it was some random college I had never heard of, like in the middle of nowhere. And I got really upset. I went home and I cried. So again, these assumptions can actually have real impacts on students and people's outcomes, right? What if she needed a letter of recommendation from her guidance counselor to apply to go to certain colleges? I mean, I certainly did. In fact, I remember going to my guidance counselor's office when I was in high school with my list of places that I wanted to apply. And my list of places included Stanford and Princeton and MIT. And my guidance counselor actually yelled at me and threw me out of her office. And she did apologize later and wrote me a letter, but it was really unpleasant. Okay. So next category we have is false colorblindness, or invalidating somebody's identity. Oh, I have a question here. Can you cite the source? Oh gosh, I don't remember which one that was for. Can anybody help me out? But I do have all the sources, so I'm happy to give you or anybody a list of sources and references at the end as well. So in any case, false colorblindness and invalidating identity. So colorblindness includes statements that indicate a person doesn't want to acknowledge race, and instead they want to focus on shared humanity. And some people of color don't necessarily see all forms of colorblindness as negative. Like, for example, in our focus group, there were people who kind of welcomed the idea that they would be treated equally by others rather than being racialized. But the problem was that they didn't actually like believe their race was unseen or unnoticed by those professing colorblindness, so it didn't really seem completely genuine. This category is named, we named false colorblindness to account for times where colorblindness functionally prevents, say, honest discussions about important racial issues. And when people of color try to express something about their racial or ethnic experience, they may be invalidated by these colorblind statements. And here's an example where a participant in our focus group said, I told my roommate that I was going to a Black Lives Matter event, and he said, no, bro, it's all lives matter. And I was like, oh, come on, man, where are the all lives matter events? Who's doing the all lives matter protests, right? So all lives matter, that's a microaggression, in case you didn't know. So this takes us to the concept of colorblindness or colorblind ideology. And colorblindness is this racial ideology that sort of advances the idea that the best way to end discrimination is by treating people as equal as possible without regard to race, culture, or ethnicity. And so at face value, colorblindness seems like a really good thing, right? You know, like Martin Luther King Jr. said, judge people on the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. And certainly there are many commonalities between people, such as their shared humanity, which is all true. But unfortunately, colorblind ideology is a form of racism because it acts as if these racial, ethnic, and cultural differences don't exist. And so like we're all gonna just like go along with the status quo, which is like white culture. And then also it doesn't see or recognize inequities, like how people are, you know, maybe are suffering as a result of their group membership, or it doesn't look at the positive qualities of their ethnic group or their cultural group. So then people feel that that part of their identity is being dismissed. And so even if we just look at this word, color blind, you know, if you break it down into parts like color, people of color, blind, we don't see you, or at least not that colorful part. You know, as a person of color, I like who I am, and I don't want any aspect of that to be unseen or invisible. And the need for color blindness implies there's something shameful with the way God made me or the culture I was born into that we shouldn't talk about. And so it's kind of helped make all of this into a taboo topic that polite people can't openly discuss. If you can't discuss it, you can't understand it, much less help address racial problems that afflict our society. Or if you're a therapist, then you can't talk about that with your clients, and then that's not helpful either. And so blind means not being able to see things, and I don't want to be blind. I want to see things clearly, even if they make me uncomfortable. And as a therapist, I need to be able to hear and see everything that my clients are communicating on many different levels, and I can't afford to be blind to anything. Like, would you want a surgeon who like operated blindfolded? Of course not. So likewise, you know, therapists shouldn't be blind either, especially to something as critical as a person's culture or racial identity. And by encouraging the exploration of race and culture, you know, we can give each other a more authentic opportunity to understand each other. And people sometimes wonder, how did we learn to become colorblind? Well, you know, this is part of our socialization process, particularly as white Americans. You know, what do you say when your kid says, Mommy, look at that Black girl? A lot of parents became very uncomfortable, flustered. Shh, don't say that. That's not nice. Be quiet. That's rude. And what does that communicate to a child? Oh, this is something I can't talk about. I can see this person looks different, but I can't talk about that. I can't recognize it. I can't make sense out of it. So then you become colorblind, right? But that's not useful, as I pointed out. If not colorblindness, then what? So when we think of a person's identity, there's a 3-part model that's also been described by Sue. And so we can think of a person's identity at 3 levels. There's individual identity, like we're all unique snowflakes. And then there's a group identity, like we're all members of certain groups. And then there's this universal human identity, right? And it's the membership in these various groups is what helps form the basis of our sense of identity. So, And so, people have lots of different groups they belong to. They might belong to, a fraternity, they might belong to a political group, they might belong to a religious organization. Also, they may have a gender that describes them, and a cultural group that describes them, and a race that describes them. And so, does a white woman not want to be recognized as a woman, or does a Jewish man not want to be recognized as Jewish, or a man? So yes, it's important to find our common humanity, because these are threads that bind all of us together across the world. But most of us also want our differences acknowledged as well, including challenges, histories, accomplishments, to be seen and recognized by others, and that's what helps us feel understood. So an alternative to color blindness is multiculturalism, which means valuing other cultures and appreciating what each person brings to the table. Now, another common stereotype from which microaggressions spring is criminality, the idea of criminality or dangerousness. So this occurs when someone demonstrates belief in or otherwise acts on stereotypes that people of color are dangerous, untrustworthy, or likely to commit crimes or cause bodily harm. It can also include concerns about being treated badly by people of color. So it could be like verbal, maybe they're worried about verbal aggression and that they're going to be emotionally harmed. African American and Latino American males tend to be victims of these types of microaggressions most often, which sometimes involves law enforcement, which can be fatal for them. One respondent in our focus group says it's like an everyday thing. I remember I was walking toward the law school to meet someone. I was walking and this white dude was in front of me, and he looked back and seen me walking behind him, and he literally kept looking over his shoulder like I was going to do something, right? So this irrational fear of people of color causes some people to call the police. Like you might remember the incident in Philadelphia where 2 Black men were arrested while waiting for a friend at Starbucks. And you only need to watch the news to find multiple incidents where police were called in response to Black people who were doing nothing dangerous or illegal at all. Examples include playing ball in a parking lot, or picking up trash with a gripper stick, or standing under an awning in the rain waiting for an Uber. And here is an example even from my own campus. I'm going to just throw my own university under the bus here for a moment, where there were some students who were skateboarding on campus. One of them was a Black student. The Black student was singled out by campus security, who demanded that he show them his student ID. He said, I don't have it on me. Let me go to my dorm or right there and get it. And they said no. They didn't believe him. They handcuffed him on the ground, and he sat on the ground in the hot sun being handcuffed while everybody around was telling the police, leave him alone. He's a student, leave him alone. And noting that they didn't pick on the white kids who were skateboarding. So that caused quite a flap, and we got a lot of negative publicity because of that. And the university said, we're going to investigate it. And they did an investigation, and many months later came out with a report that admitted that at least part of the reason he was singled out was racially motivated, right? So that's always unpleasant. All right. So another type of microaggression is denial of individual racism. So in contrast to false color blindness, this type of microaggression occurs when a person tries to make a case that they don't have any racial biases. And because nobody wants to admit they have biases. Nobody likes, no one wants to be called racist, right? So some ways that people do this is like they might talk about like anti-racist things that they've done, or connections that they have with people of color. And it's often triggered by maybe perceived scrutiny of the offender's behavior. This is the most interesting man in the world who says, I don't always say I'm not racist, but when I do, I'm about to say something extremely racist. So whenever I hear somebody say, I'm not a racist, but I'm like, no, stop, don't say it, because you know what's coming, it's going to be racist. So this is often employed as a response to criticism. It can be invalidating to people of color who are trying to draw attention to problematic behavior. It's been called the contested microaggression. because people might be saying, oh, I couldn't have committed a microaggression because like I'm such a good non-racist person. And here's an example. Here's an example from therapy where a therapist says to a client, oh, as a gay person, I know just what it's like to be discriminated against because of race. And this person is engaging in over-identification, which denies or minimizes his own potential bias because of assumed similarity. And he's saying your racial oppression is no different than my form of oppression, and therefore I can't be racist because I'm like you and I share your pain. And so, first of all, being gay is not the same as being Black or Hispanic or Asian. All these things may be difficult, but not in the same way, right? And so, and often, an LGBTQ person can choose whether or not to disclose and to whom, and most people of color can't do that. But more importantly, anyone can be racist. Anyone can say or do a racist thing, even a sexual minority, and even somebody who is an ethnic or racial minority. And no one is immune to the negative social messages or these pathological stereotypes, as it were, that disproportionately denigrate people of color. So this therapist statement actually proves that he really doesn't understand. All right. And so here's another example called the myth of meritocracy, or race is irrelevant for success. So this occurs when people deny the ongoing existence of systemic racism or harmful discriminatory behavior, specifically in regard to personal achievement or barriers to achievement. It often co-occurs, for example, like sexual gender minority people, they might say, oh, well, they're more successful and wealthy. So people may refute that white privilege is an unearned benefit that results in tangible differences in outcomes or a personal or societal level. And instead they embrace the myth of meritocracy and the notion that determinants of success are rooted only in personal efforts, which isn't true at all. So, so in their own words, one of our focus group respondents said, I had a mixed girlfriend of mine sit there and say, Black people are just blaming the system and they need to take advantage of, the opportunities they have. And it's like, well, really, how many opportunities do we have? Can you sit up here and put a list of how many opportunities we as African Americans have compared to all the opportunities that whites have, or, Asian Americans or Mexican Americans? Because if you sat up there and compared the list, our list is going to be pretty short. Yeah. All right, and so someone had raised the question before of reverse racism, and this is a type of microaggression called reverse racism hostility. And this includes expressions of jealousy or hostility surrounding the notion that people of color are getting like all these unfair advantages and benefits due to their race, often coupled with the assertion that white people are being treated unjustly and suffering as a result, which of course, there's no evidence that shows us this. But anyway, embedded in this sentiment is the idea that people of color are undeserving of success. And this category includes white resentment and hostility about affirmative action. And then we also even see this in Canada too, towards Indigenous people with microaggressions surrounding what's been termed withstanding jealous accusations, in relation to that ethnic group. So a couple of our respondents said that they were told, then he said that Black on white crime is also very prevalent and that we should stop killing them because of their race, and that I have Black privilege. At that point, I was like, I didn't want to know what he meant by that. If there's Black privilege, I haven't seen it. I would like some. And another says, someone said to them, why are you still calling yourself African American? You're no more African than I am Australian. And I was like, it's not my fault that I was cut off from my heritage. I didn't choose that life. All right. And here is another example of a microaggression. And I think this also perpetuates some of these unfortunate stereotypes or microaggressions where we have, these are scholarships that these 3 scholars of color earned. And here for this photo up there holding these gigantic checks that makes them look like lottery winners. So what's the message here? Like, oh, look what we did. Look what we're giving them. look at the logo, look at the money. I think this really steals the achievement from these scholars and turns them into tokenized photo ops, and also fuels that reverse racism myth by presenting these scholars as winners rather than as, smart, talented, hardworking future leaders of tomorrow. All right. So another category, pathologizing minority culture or appearance. And this occurs when people of color are criticized due to real or perceived cultural differences in appearance, tradition, behaviors, or preferences. And embedded in this sentiment is the idea that whiteness is preferred, and consequently there's something negative or shameful about a non-white identity. Hence, microaggressions may include statements that advance pronouncements of apparent whiteness as complimentary. And these statements are overwhelmingly reported as upsetting and insulting to people on the receiving end of those. So I'm gonna stop right there and take some time for more questions if people have any.